All right, let's jump into this deep dive. We're tackling natural resources this time, and more specifically, coal and petroleum. Got some textbook excerpts here, but trust me, it gets way more interesting than just rocks and fuel.
Oh, for sure. It's really about tracing those resources back to their origins, how we use them, and what it all means in the grand scheme of things.
Right from the start, this chapter throws out this idea of inexhaustible versus exhaustible resources. Like, we've got sunlight, which is pretty much a given, right? Versus something like a forest. Seems like a simple distinction at first, but I have a feeling it's going to be a big deal.
Huge, actually, because it forces us to confront this kind of harsh reality. Our planet doesn't have an endless supply of everything, right? And that completely changes how we need to think about consumption, sustainability, the whole nine yards.
Speaking of consumption, there's this really clever analogy in the chapter using popcorn, like the kind you eat, right, to make a point. It talks about splitting people into different generations and having them all share one bowl of popcorn.
Ah, right. That one's a classic, and it's so effective
Yeah.
because it lets you actually experience, in a way, what resource depletion feels like. Like, you might start out with this overflowing bowl thinking abundance, but then, depending on how many people are digging in, that popcorn can vanish fast. And suddenly, the next generation is left with, like, just a handful. Makes you think about what we're leaving for them, you know?
Totally. It's like one generation is living the high life on popcorn, and the next is stuck with crumbs. Not exactly a recipe for a happy family, right? So from popcorn, we move on to coal, which, I'll be honest, I mostly just think of as fuel for power plants and stuff, but the way it's actually made is kind of wild.
It's true. You don't often think about where it comes from, do you?
Not really.
Well, this chapter dives into that whole process, carbonization, they call it. And it basically boils down to millions of years of ancient forests getting buried, squished, and heated under tons and tons of pressure, like nature's pressure cooker, but on a massive scale and a really long timeline.
Talk about slow cooking. But that time scale really hits home this idea we were just talking about, doesn't it? We think in terms of human lifespans, maybe 100 years if you're lucky. But with coal formation, we're talking geological time, millions upon millions of years.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway here. Coal might seem abundant now, but it's definitely a finite resource. Something had to die, and something had to be buried for a very, very long time to make what we've got.
Okay, so from the slow cooker, we move on to maybe more of a pressure cooker, because petroleum formation is a whole other beast.
Yeah, totally different process.
Yeah.
It's incredible when you think about it. We're talking about tiny little sea creatures, right? Dying and sinking to the ocean floor over eons, building up these layers and layers of organic material. And then the pressure, and I mean immense pressure.
Yeah, this chapter really emphasizes the whole pressure aspect, doesn't it?
Right. And it's not just any pressure. It's the weight of all that sediment building up on top of these ancient marine organisms, sand, clay, all of that crushing down over millions of years. That, combined with the Earth's internal heat and a lack of oxygen, that's the recipe for petroleum. It's really quite something.
And again, it's not just about the how, it's the how long. Like with coal, we're talking about a process that takes millions and millions of years. It really puts things into perspective when we think about how quickly we consume these resources, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, you often hear people talking about running out of fossil fuels, but it's not like they just disappear overnight, right? It's more about recognizing that these resources formed over ridiculously long periods, and we're using them up at a rate that's just, well, it's not sustainable, to put it mildly.
It really makes you think about that saying. They don't make them like they used to, you know? Like in this case, they literally don't. But it's not just about fuel, right? I remember this chapter getting into all the things we get from petroleum. It's kind of amazing.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get stuck thinking about petroleum as just like gasoline for our cars and trucks. But it's in so much more than that. This chapter really opens your eyes to just how many products we use every day that started out as petroleum.
Right. It's things like, what, kerosene, diesel fuel. I even remember seeing paraffin wax on that list, which always makes me think about those old-fashioned candy jars for some reason.
Exactly. And that's not even getting into the really complex stuff like this whole petrochemical web thing. Honestly, the first time I read about it, it kind of blew my mind.
Okay, yeah. Tell me more about the whole petrochemical web idea, because I remember that being a big part of the chapter too, this whole idea that petroleum is used in things you'd never expect.
It's true. It's like this whole hidden network of products that we rely on, all connecting back to petroleum as a raw material. We're talking everyday stuff, plastics, fertilizers, even some medicines, they all depend on petroleum in one way or another.
Wow. It's like this whole other layer of how we depend on this one resource. It's pretty mind-blowing when you really think about it. But, okay, so we know it takes forever to form, and we use it for a ton of stuff. But the chapter doesn't exactly shy away from the big problem here, does it?
No, not at all. And this is where that whole idea of exhaustibility comes back in a big way. This chapter makes it crystal clear fossil fuels, and that includes petroleum, are limited.
And it's not just about running out, right? There's a whole other side to this when you think about what happens when we burn these fuels.
Exactly. That's where the environmental impact comes into play. The chapter talks about pollution, global warming, all these huge problems that are directly related to our reliance on fossil fuels. It's a pretty sobering reality check, for sure. We can't just focus on finding alternatives because we're running low. We need to find them for the health of the planet, too.
Makes you wonder, though, are all fossil fuels created equal? I mean, we've been talking about coal and petroleum, but there's natural gas, too, right? And I remember this chapter mentioning it as being cleaner. What's that all about?
Oh, that's a great point. It's easy to lump all fossil fuels together, but they definitely have their differences. And yeah, natural gas often gets labeled as the cleaner option, but it's important to understand what that actually means.
So break it down for me. What makes natural gas cleaner exactly?
Well, it mainly comes down to what's released when you burn it. Compared to coal or oil, natural gas produces fewer of those nasty pollutants, things like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And those are the guys that contribute to smog and acid rain, not exactly things we want more of.
Right, definitely not. So less of that stuff is a good thing, for sure. But I'm also thinking about the bigger picture here, climate change, all that. Burning natural gas still releases carbon dioxide, doesn't it?
You got it. And that's a really important point that this chapter emphasizes. It's not enough to just be less bad, right? Natural gas might have some advantages when it comes to certain pollutants, but it's still a fossil fuel at the end of the day. Burning it still contributes to those carbon emissions that are driving climate change. There's no such thing as a free lunch, unfortunately, even when it comes to energy.
It really drives home that everything is connected, doesn't it? This whole deep dive from that popcorn analogy showing how quickly resources can vanish to learning about how long it takes for these fossil fuels to even form in the first place, and then to wrap our heads around how much we use petroleum. It's a lot.
It really is. But awareness is where it all starts, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I appreciate about this chapter. It takes these really complex ideas and breaks them down in a way that's relatable and easy to grasp. Because once you understand where these resources come from, how we use them, and what the consequences are, that's when we can start making more informed decisions, both as individuals and as a society, right?
Totally. From ancient forests to like microscopic sea creatures, it's incredible how interconnected our lives are with these fossil fuels. And I think what I'm taking away from this chapter is that there are no easy answers, but it definitely gives you a lot to think about.
Absolutely. It challenges us to consider the true cost of what we consume and to support the development of better alternatives, things that are actually sustainable in the long run.
Well said. This deep dive into coal and petroleum has been really eye-opening, to say the least. So to everyone listening, if any of this piqued your curiosity, I highly recommend checking out this chapter. It's a great starting point for understanding that a complex issue that affects every single one of us.